The call came in at 11:47 p.m., and Tessa Broward almost didn't answer it. She was already in her car, already halfway out of the Queensway Carlton parking lot, already thinking about nothing except getting home, getting her boots off, and not thinking about the 14-hour shift she'd just finished. Her phone lit up on the passenger seat, unknown number. She let it ring twice, then picked up. "Is this Tessa Broward?" "Registered nurse, cardiac unit, speaking. This is Constable Renat, Ottawa Police. We have a situation at your mother's address on Baseline. I need you to come down." She didn't remember the drive. She only remembered that by the time she turned onto her mother's street, there were two cruisers parked outside, lights still rolling, and a neighbor in a bathrobe standing on the sidewalk watching with the particular stillness of someone who had already decided this was someone else's problem. Her mother, Greta Broward, was sitting on the front steps wrapped in a blanket someone had given her. 71 former letter carrier, 34 years with Canada Post, both knees replaced, and the kind of woman who still shoveled her own driveway in January because she didn't want to be a burden. She was holding the blanket at her throat with both hands, and she looked small in a way Tessa had never seen before. Tessa got out of the car, and the first thing she noticed was that her mother's hands were shaking. The second thing she noticed was Constable Renat. He was standing maybe 3 meters from the steps, arms crossed, talking to his partner in a voice too low to carry. He was broad across the shoulders, mid-30s, and the way he was positioned, slightly turned away from Greta, angled toward the street, made it clear that as far as he was concerned, the situation had already been handled, and he was just waiting for someone to come collect the problem. "What happened?" Tessa said, and she was looking at her mother when she said it, not at him. Greta opened her mouth. Constable Renat spoke first. "We received a call from a neighbor about a disturbance. When we arrived, your mother was outside. She became agitated when we asked her to go back inside." "Agitated," Tessa said. "She refused to cooperate." Tessa crouched down in front of her mother. Greta's eyes were watery and she was blinking too fast, not crying but close to it, and Tessa recognized the particular look of someone who had been frightened and was now trying very hard to pretend they hadn't been. "Mom, what happened?" "I heard something in the backyard," Greta said. Her voice came out thin, a banging. "I thought it was the gate, but then it kept going and I couldn't tell. So I came outside to look at 11 at night. I wasn't going to sleep anyway, my hip's been." She stopped. "I came outside and then the lights were there and they were asking me all these questions and I told them I live here. This is my house. I've lived here for 31 years. She didn't have ID," Renat said from behind Tessa. Tessa stood up slowly. She turned around. "She's in her own front yard," Tessa said. "At 11 o'clock at night. In her housecoat. We still need to verify. Her name is on the mortgage. Her name is on the mailbox," Tessa pointed. There it was. G. Broward, white letters on black metal. Same mailbox that had been there since 1993. She's 71 years old with 2 knee replacements, and she came outside because she heard something in her yard. She called no one. She threatened no one. She is sitting on her own front steps in February. Renat's jaw tightened. "Ma'am, I understand you're concerned, but your mother was uncooperative. She was frightened. She refused to answer basic questions because she didn't know why she was being questioned." Tessa kept her voice level. She was aware that her voice being level was costing her something. She came outside to check on a noise. "You showed up and started treating her like a suspect. That's not being uncooperative. That's being a 71-year-old woman who doesn't understand why police are asking her to prove she lives in her own home." There was a pause. Renat's partner, who had been very quiet this entire time, shifted her weight. "We're going to need your name," Renat said. "Tessa Broward. I'm her daughter. I'm also an RN at Queensway Carlton. I just finished a 14-hour shift in the cardiac unit, and right now I am looking at my mother, and I'm seeing elevated respiratory rate and tremor in both hands that was not there when I called her this afternoon, so I am asking you, respectfully, to please tell me what happened so I can take care of her." Renat looked at her for a long moment. "Your mother raised her voice at responding officers," he said, "because she was scared. The call came from a neighbor who reported a disturbance. The disturbance was a gate latch. My mother already told you that." Something shifted in his face then, not softening, exactly, but recalibrating. like he was deciding something. He uncrossed his arms. He looked at his partner, and the partner looked at him, and Tessa recognized that look too. She'd seen it in hospitals when a doctor realized a chart had been misread and was figuring out how to proceed without saying so out loud. "We'll need a statement," Renaud said finally. "Tonight? It's standard procedure." Tessa looked at her mother. Greta was watching the exchange with the careful blankness of someone who has learned that watching too visibly only makes things worse. "She needs to go inside," Tessa said. "She's cold and she's in pain. I'll give you my number. If you need a statement, you can call me." Renaud started to say something. The second cruiser door opened. The woman who got out was older, late 40s, sergeant stripes, short dark hair going gray at the temples. She'd been parked at the curb the whole time, and Tessa hadn't noticed her. She came up the walk with her hands loose at her sides, not hurrying, and she looked at Greta first. Just looked at her. The way someone looks when they're actually seeing what's in front of them. "Mrs. Broward," she said. Her voice was quiet. "I'm Sergeant Duval. I'm sorry you've been standing out in the cold. Why don't we get you inside?" It wasn't a question. It was the kind of calm that comes from having seen a lot and having decided a long time ago which things mattered. Greta stood up, slowly, and Tessa took her arm without being asked. They went inside. Sergeant Duval sat at the kitchen table across from Greta while Tessa put the kettle on, and she listened, actually listened, not in the way where someone is just waiting for the other person to finish, while Greta explained about the gate latch, about the noise, about coming outside and the lights and the questions she didn't understand. Duval took notes by hand in a small notebook. She didn't interrupt. When Greta was done, Duval said, "Do you have a number we can reach you at if we need to follow up?" Greta gave it to her. "I'm going to look into how tonight was handled," Duval said. She said it plainly, without promises attached to it, which was the only way Tessa trusted anyone to say something like that. Then she stood up, and she nodded at Tessa, and she let herself out. Tessa stood in the kitchen for a moment after she heard the door close. The kettle was starting to hiss. Her mother was sitting at the table with her hands wrapped around the mug. Tessa had already put in front of her chamomile, same thing she'd been drinking since Tessa was 8 years old. "She was nice," Greta said. "Yeah," Tessa said. "She was the other one." Greta started and then stopped and looked at her hands. "I know," Tessa said. She sat down. They didn't talk for a while. The kettle clicked off. Outside, the police cars were gone. The neighbor in the bathrobe had gone back inside. The street was empty and quiet and completely ordinary, and Tessa kept thinking about the way her mother's hands had been shaking and the way Renaud had spoken, not loudly, not with any particular malice, but in that specific register that communicates very clearly that someone is a problem to be managed rather than a person to be listened to. She thought about how many times that had happened without someone like Sergeant Duval being in the second car. She thought about how her mother would not have called her if Tessa hadn't already been called, would have sat on those steps and answered whatever questions she was told to answer, and then gone inside and not slept and not said anything, because Greta Broward was from a generation that did not make complaints about authority, that assumed if something went wrong it was probably because you had done something to cause it. She thought about that for a long time. In the weeks after, Tessa didn't plan to do anything. She called the police professional standards unit, which she'd found by searching the Ottawa Police Service website at 2 a.m. on her phone. She filled out a form. She wrote down what had happened as clearly as she could, without adjectives, just the sequence of events, the way she'd been trained to write incident reports. Date, time, location. What was observed. She expected nothing from it, which was why she was surprised when someone called her back. The investigator's name was Bott. He called her on a Tuesday afternoon, asked if she had 20 minutes. She was on her lunch break in the hospital cafeteria, and she walked outside into the parking garage where it was quieter and stood between two cars and told the whole thing again. Bott listened. He asked clarifying questions. At the end, he said, "I want to be transparent with you. This may not result in formal discipline, but what you're describing is something we need to look at. I'm not doing this to get anyone in trouble," Tessa said. And then she stopped, because that wasn't quite true. "I'm doing this because my mother didn't do anything wrong, and she spent an hour on her own front steps being treated like she had." "I understand," Bott said. "We'll be in touch." She didn't hear from anyone for 6 weeks. She went back to work. She did her 12-hour shifts, sometimes 14, came home and ate whatever was easiest and slept and got up and did it again. She checked on her mother every few days. Greta seemed fine, maybe more careful than before, more aware of which lights she left on at night, checking her locks twice, but fine. They didn't talk about it much. Greta wasn't a woman who processed things out loud. Tessa called her brother in Sudbury once. He said, "You should let it go, Tess. What's the point?" She didn't call him again about it. In February, 7 weeks after the initial complaint, she got an email asking if she would be willing to participate in a formal review. She said yes. The review was held in a meeting room at a building on Elgin Street. There were 3 people across the table from her, none of them in uniform. One of them was Sergeant Duval. Tessa hadn't expected that. Duval didn't say anything during Tessa's portion. She sat with her hands folded on the table, and she listened in the same way she'd listened in Greta's kitchen, quietly, attentively, like she had already made the decision to take what she heard seriously before she even arrived. After Tessa spoke, one of the others asked her questions. Clarifying questions, procedural questions. Was she aware of this policy? Did she understand the distinction between this and that? She answered everything as carefully as she could. At the end, the person running the review, a woman named Marchetti, civilian, reading glasses on a chain, said, "Mims, Broward, I want to thank you for your time and for the detail you've provided. I know this process isn't easy. I just want to know it means something," Tessa said. Marchetti looked at her. "So do we," she said. It was the most honest thing anyone official had said to her in 2 months, and Tessa held on to it. 3 months later, Constable Renault was formally reprimanded. The terms weren't public, but a contact at the service told Tessa, off the record, that he'd been required to complete additional training in elder-focused community policing, and that his next 2 performance reviews would include specific observation criteria related to de-escalation. It wasn't what the comment section would have asked for. It wasn't losing his pension or being barred from the profession. Tessa knew that. She thought about the comment she'd read once on a video like this. Corrupt cops should be fired, lose all credibility, never have authority over people again, and she understood why people felt that way. She had felt it herself, sitting in the parking garage listening to Bot. But she also worked in a hospital. She knew what it meant when a process actually resulted in documentation, in observation, in changed behavior that got tracked. She knew the difference between accountability that existed on paper and accountability that changed what happened the next time. This was the next time that mattered. She called her mother to tell her. Greta was quiet for a moment, then she said, "What does that mean, exactly?" "The training. It means the next time he responds to a call involving an older person, there are different expectations for how he's supposed to handle it." Another pause. "And if he doesn't, then it's documented, and it becomes part of a pattern." Greta made a sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite skepticism, the sound of someone deciding whether something was worth hoping about. "Your father would have just let it go," she said finally. "I know. He always said you couldn't fight. I know, Mom, but you didn't." Tessa didn't say anything to that. "The woman," Greta said, "the one who sat in the kitchen, Sergeant Duval, was she part of this, the review?" "Yes." Another pause. "She seemed like someone who meant it," Greta said, when she said she'd look into it. She didn't say it like people usually say things like that. Tessa had thought about that too, about how rare that was. Not the sergeant who did her job, there were people like that everywhere, she believed that, but the visibility of it. The luck of having Duval in the second car. The luck of the call coming when it did. The luck of Tessa answering her phone. She thought about her mother sitting on those steps and what would have happened if none of those things had lined up. She didn't say any of this to Greta. "She meant it," Tessa said. The Ottawa Police Service released a policy update in April. It applied to calls involving residents over 65, specifically addressing verification procedures and documentation requirements when the call did not involve an active threat. Sergeant Duval was listed as one of the contributing reviewers. Tessa read it on her phone at the nursing station at 6 in the morning, between a 12-hour and the start of a 12-hour, the way she read most things these days. She read it twice. She saved the link. She didn't tell anyone at work. There was nothing to tell, exactly. She had done a thing, a normal thing, a thing that was supposed to be available to anyone, and it had resulted in a normal outcome. She hadn't been brave. She'd been angry and tired, and she'd filled out a form. But she thought about it sometimes. On the drives home, on the nights she couldn't sleep. She thought about all the Gretas who didn't have someone arrive in their parking lot at midnight, who didn't have a daughter who knew how to write an incident report, who understood what de-escalation training meant, who knew which form to fill out. She thought about the ones who went back inside and didn't say anything because they thought it was their fault, or because they didn't know there was a form, or because they'd been told all their lives that you don't make trouble. She thought about what it would take for that to change. She thought about Sergeant Duval sitting in a meeting room on Elgin Street with her hands folded on the table, and she thought, one person in the right moment doing the obvious thing. It doesn't always work. She knew that too. But sometimes it does.